carrying that into the next week of training or the next few weeks or the next competition, you're not going in, with the mindset of like, how do I nail this? You're going in with the mindset of like, I'm a piece of shit.
Well, and the way I look at it too is stress is useful because it essentially provides a signal to the system that it needs to adapt. But that only works if it's within a short acute period. You know, there seems to be this issue with people who are experiencing prolonged stress because they're depressed, they're anxious, they have poor emotional regulation. They're under this chronic state which seems to be very negative in terms of being able to build up your sensory motor system and skill acquisition, your ability to sleep, your ability to recover. So it seems that the good people can have that negative emotional response of like, shit, I lost. I don't want that to happen again. What do I need to do? And all of a sudden you've created this centrally mediated state of I need to change to improve, and therefore you create a system or a situation where, I don't know if it happens maybe at an epigenetic level where it's like, all right, give us the stimulus we need and we're going to make sure we maximize the response.
To be honest, on a lot of these things, I got down to just ask the coach. Like honestly, on a lot of these things, is like these sort of like complex psychological ideas, or even some of the physiological ones, I just got down to holistic is good, and then people that like know their shit about a certain sport. And so like some coaches that were very successful is like, sometimes I can just tell from like the way they get out of their car at training and things like that.
You can tell by the demeanor.
Yeah, exactly. And so I felt like that's something that we need to try do a better job of like systematizing, because it's not realistic that you have an expert coach in every like talent hotbed that you can like watch how everyone rocks up to training. But it's like, and this is an open question because I don't think we got to it, but it's like, how do you systematize some of these like completely subjective things that are actually like
very
probably
important,
closer to the truth than like some survey that you can, there's this really interesting thing going on at the moment in kind of like Australian sport. It's in relation to data that I think like all data we collect is going to be classed as like health information, which then changes like how it's treated and things like that. But anyway, like whether you agree or not with that is not the point. Personally, I think we sometimes fall into the trap of collecting way too much information and not doing anything with it. So I'm actually really interested to see what happens. But anyway, in reading some of the documentation around it, there was just this one or two sentences that I found really interesting. And it was like, we feel like in this like age of like all this information, we're forgetting about the ability of humans to distill complex sources of information into simple things. And I know there's like, AI and stuff that's coming along that can probably do that as well. But I think like that just that line, like ability to distill complex like inputs into a recommendation, like that's something that we shouldn't lose. And we shouldn't try and like, we need this like objective questionnaire where actually if you ask a coach with experience or knowledge, like they'll just be able to tell you.
And more importantly too, if you've got some questionnaire, it's quite impersonable. So how someone reads a question and answer, it's going to be very different to going like, how you doing today? And actually
100%.
getting an idea of what's their body language, what's their eye contact like, what's their tone of voice.
It's funny you say that because, the discussions that I have with Tudor, one of the things that we talk about is, funnily enough, like one of the things that often tends to be a huge factor in when someone has good performances or even like a good period of training is, like, are they generally quite happy in their life? Because if they are, you tend to get good results that come out, which on the surface seems like such a simplistic and kind of almost naive way of looking at it. But I think it comes down to exactly what you're saying of like, if they're in a state that means that they're able to absorb stresses, as you were mentioning before, Jack, they're probably going to adapt to their training better, even if the training stimulus is not perfect.
Well, an example of that is I remember I think it must have been Monday, or give you context, Saturday evening, we went to a wedding. It was one of a runner who used to be in John's track squad, and so a lot of John's track athletes are there. And I remember talking to one of your athletes earlier this week, and they said on the Sunday, their mega wave readings were like the best have actually ever been, basically ever. And part of that is because she was at a wedding, had a really good time, really enjoyed herself. And so obviously that social component to it had a big impact on having a positive stimulus on her neural system. And I think that just really highlights what you're saying here with being holistic of, you can't just look about the training stimulus or just the objective measures in themselves, because you're missing sometimes the bigger picture.
And more and more as my practice has developed over, like I've been doing this since 2013, like more and more as my practice has developed, I've like looked outside and of my discipline and kind of just tried to get the bigger picture of like, where does this actually fit in? And I was part of a workshop the other day at the VIS, which I thought was really interesting and a good thing to do, just about optimizing our performance teams. And a comment that I made was like, if you were to like hypothetically try and write out the job description of every member of a performance team, to me, the coach is really the only one who's in their job description would be to like look at things holistically, because they're the only one to me that has to like rank at a certain point in time, rank like physiology below nutrition but above psychology, and like, you know, between biomechanics and this, whereas like a good practitioner will have some awareness of that, but it's actually not my job to try and work out like all the time, like where it kind of like sits.
It's such a good point, because it's something that I think I've really struggled with, as I said early on in this talk, with service providers that aren't necessarily thinking that way. Yeah. And it's like, I'm trying to say to them, well, I'm thinking about 10 different things at the same time. You're thinking about one and trying to tell me that's the most important, and it's because it's the thing that you look after. But understand that, like, in my priority list, you're number 7 at the moment. So just calm the fuck down.
I think it's an interesting balance, because, like, I think, like, I've just gotten to the point now I just kind of, like, ask the coaches directly, like, how they would like me to operate. Because I think, like, if I, say, just started 100% of the time thinking in this, like, sort of hierarchical way, then I feel like I'm kind of already watering down something that, you know, you might end up watering down. So it's like, I think it's important to keep like...
It's not even... I think...
watering down is the wrong way to look at it.
They're not even in order though, really. Like, they're all there